Good morning, everybody. Welcome to Impact and Coffee today. My name is Robert Nelson. I am the program manager for the Grants Collective. As you're being admitted into the room, know that you're on mute, and if you're not on mute, please mute yourself. And also, if you want to turn off your video too, that kind of helps us save up on some bandwidth as well. So we'll just keep on admitting folks in. Mariah, would you like to introduce yourself really quickly?
Good morning, everybody. Thank you for joining us. I'm seeing the usual familiar faces and some new ones, and I just love that. We're never really sure each week to week who we're going to have and how many, and so I want to welcome you. I'm in my new role at the City of Albuquerque in the Department of Family and Community Services as the Nonprofit and Philanthropy Coordinator, and it looks to be that I will be able to continue my role co-coordinating with Impact and Coffee, which you know is one of the joys of my life. And so welcome today. We're happy to have you. And go ahead, Robert. Who else are we going to go ahead and introduce our cast?
We'll just do a really quick overview really quick. So Impact and Coffee is a welcoming conversation. For those who don't know, Impact and Coffee is a welcoming conversation in which we build community amongst the nonprofit sector here in Albuquerque. We meet 3 times, the first 3 Tuesdays of the month, typically at Albuquerque Community Foundation, but there's this thing going on right now called the pandemic. So so we've gone virtual and we're doing some really great stuff right now and hearing from some amazing folks doing really awesome things in our community to help us get by through this really interesting crisis that we're going through. And hopefully we'll be out of it very soon and things will go back, not back to normal. My hope is that we don't go back to business as usual and that we have come back to a better community and better things. So typically we do like 2 speakers, but we've been doing a very special panel series. So we're going to take folks through a battery of questions. There's some cool folks in the audience. I know it's Kim Gleason's here. Welcome, Kim. Good to see you. And then, it's Gratitude Tuesday. So Mariah, is there anything that you're grateful for today?
I'm really grateful for the rain that we had yesterday. I went out on my back porch and spent some time just breathing in some moisture and the sunset at the same time. Like, where do I live? This is amazing. Very grateful for Albuquerque weather and my house right now.
Awesome. Thank you for that. I'm grateful for the fact that it is Asian Pacific American History Month. It's a good time just to celebrate our culture and history throughout. It's also, I believe, Domestic Violence Month too, if I'm correct on that front, or is it Cancer Front? Sorry, there's a lot of months, but there's a lot of things to celebrate and also a lot of things to be aware of. Check it out if you can. If you have anything that you're thankful for, grateful for, please share in the chat. We'd love to hear from our audience, especially about what's going on in their lives and what celebrating a practice of gratitude. So a big shout out to all of our team members who make Impact and Coffee happen every single week. So Destiny Logan's on the call from Global Ties ABQ, Michael Green over at New Mexico Farmers Marketing Association, Erin Hielkema over at the Grand Plant, and Jamie Chester is here too. So she's over there at the South LA Economic Development Center. She does awesome stuff. I know she was working on a grant yesterday and super busy. We love her, love her, love her. And also not on the call today because I think he's at a board meeting is Juan Abita. He's over at La Red doing some really great work there. For those of you just joining on the call, Impact and Coffee happens 3 times a month. And we're just going to jump into introductions to our speakers. So just to the left of me is Simona. Simona, would you like to say hello? Awesome wave, love the energy. Say a little bit about yourself, your organization, and what brings you here today.
My name's Simona Muniz. I teach 7th grade New Mexico history. I'm at Jimmy Carter on the west side, like west side, South Valley. We intersect a little bit. And I think that's it. Is that all I'm supposed to say?
What brings you here this morning, Simona?
Oh, what brought me here this morning was my friend Jamie Chester. Yeah, she hit me up and asked me if I would be willing to participate.
Awesome. Welcome and thank you for being here. Right next to you is Miranda. Miranda, say hello and just introduce yourself a little bit.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm Miranda Evjen Sanchez. I'm the Director of Student Experience at CNM. I am here because I was invited by Michael Green and super excited just to share with you all a little bit about kind of how we're navigating this new landscape that we're in and what we're doing to try and help our students in our community.
Thank you, Miranda, and welcome. Right next to you, actually in a big line, is all of our panelists. So Duta, could you please introduce yourself?
Yeah, good morning, everybody. My name is Anpao Duta Flying Earth. Everyone calls me Duta. I'm the executive director for the Native American Community Academy and the NACA Inspired Schools Network. And I'm here because Aaron invited me, so I'm thankful to see you guys and happy to be here.
Thank you, Duta, and welcome. And last but not least is our friend Jeff Andersen. Hello, Jeff, and welcome.
Hello, I'm with ABC Community Schools as a community school program specialist, as well as working with Any Given Child, fiscally sponsored entity from the Rio Grande Community Development Corporation, SYNC, focusing on arts education in the classroom, working with students and bringing them rich arts experiences. And Jamie invited me, but I know all the Impact and Coffee folks for several years now, so excited to be here. Thank you.
Just a reminder to folks, if you're joining just now, please make sure that you're on mute. And also, if you could, you can turn off your video. That helps us save on a little bandwidth. I know internet has been a little dicey lately because a lot of people are using the internet right now. So just make sure that you're on mute. Also, chat. So we're monitoring the chat. If you have any questions for the speakers, please post them in the chat. And we'll try to lift them up as much as we can, but if we don't get to them, I apologize beforehand, but we'll try. Anyway, we'll go ahead and get started with our very first question. So the way this will work is we'll ask one question, then we'll just go through each panelist one at a time. So the first question we typically ask today is, we know that this has been a really challenging time for a lot of organizations and all of our community. What challenges has your organization faced in the last 2 months? And can you just talk a little bit about what those look like for you? So we'll start with you, Simona.
Okay, so our biggest challenge at Jimmy Carter is probably a similar challenge that a lot of schools in Albuquerque face. We're working with a really at-risk population, super low income. A lot of us teachers are also in that bracket. So the biggest challenge was being able to reach the kids technologically to teach. So we passed out a bunch of Chromebooks. A bunch of them didn't work. The kids had to bring them back. Not a lot of parents, or some parents don't have cars. Some parents, a lot of parents are still working. Fast food and janitorial. So they're not able to wake their kids up, our students up for class. So just reaching them has been extremely difficult. Yeah.
Thank you for that, Simona. Miranda, could you talk a little bit about the challenges your organization is facing?
Sure. One of the things I love about CNM is that they are really thoughtful on how they do things, and not only for students, but for staff and faculty as well. And so in this transition to being online, we face some of the same issues that Simona was talking about, trying to get people access to internet technologies. We've been giving out desktop computers and any technology that we can get our hands on to give to students. We've been doing that. But also for staff and faculty, some folks who may or may not be able to work remotely, we've been really doing a lot to find different things for folks to be able to do so that they can keep their full hours, and just doing a variety of things to make sure that we can keep people whole, and keep them still able to support their families and in the community. And so that's been pretty cool for us, but definitely getting a hold of students. And then we're hearing a lot from them that they're feeling having a hard time with like motivation to carry on, which I know I feel it some days where I wake up and I'm like, oh gosh, you know, how much coffee am I going to need today? But it's a real thing that we're all kind of facing. Brene Brown was talking about that it's not like a single catastrophe that we're facing. It's this like slow burn, and that we have to build up our stamina to try and keep it going. And so that's a few things that we've been kind of coming up against.
Thanks for that. And thanks for sharing stories about our families too. I know lots of folks are working and trying to take care of children at the same time, which can be really rough. And trying to find solutions for folks is been paramount throughout this entire thing. Duta, could you talk a little bit about the challenges NACA's facing lately?
Yeah, similar to Simona and Miranda, just getting in contact with students, access to technology, connectivity, and devices. And I think, two other things that really jump out to me is, the virus has disproportionately hit Native American communities. And I think we're somewhere around 58% of the cases in New Mexico are impacting Native communities. And we constitute, I might get this wrong, somebody on the call right knows better, but I think 10 to 11% of the population in the state. And, just thinking about the impacts it has on families. And of course, we're located in Albuquerque, but a lot of our sister schools are on the Navajo Reservation as well as the Pueblos. And it's disruptive to have your home feel like somewhere that's not safe. Right, like the historical inequity of reservations are such that we were placed on those land bases, but over time it's been built into home. It was home, and at the same time there's some confines and there's some restrictions that are related to the colonization of those lands, and I think that has to do with the effect that it's having now. And so, a lot of it is really working with families and students around like how do you heal from that stress and anxiety and the trauma that's felt related to the sickness. Like we've had a few families in Zia, some in Santa Ana and San Felipe, as well as Zuni that are directly affected. The second piece, and this is another huge bucket, is NACA was founded on the concept of relevant education that is really about how do students, families, and the community see themselves in the content and context of what we're teaching and delivering at NACA. That's a challenge, right? And so like in this world of the multitude of resources that I'm sure the other panelists are fielding, there aren't too many that are culturally specific, relevant, and responsive for our students and families. And so what tends to be is a wave of kind of one size fits all standardized resources, which are helpful for sure. I'm not going to say they're not. And there's a need for us to NACA-ize, indigenize, contextualize what that means for our communities and families.
Thank you, Duta. I appreciate you sharing that, especially with our long history of colonization here in New Mexico. It's important to realize some of the rooted causes in some of the problems that we're seeing in parts of our state. Jeff, could you talk a little bit about what's going on with your organization and what challenges are you facing?
Yeah, I think a lot of similar issues as the other panelists. With Any Given Child in particular, the goal is to provide live arts experiences through education and artists presenting their work to the students in some form or fashion. So trying to figure out how to replicate that digitally, but also acknowledging that as has been mentioned, the digital divide is real, and not everyone has equitable access to online resources. So trying to bridge that, balance that between, do we spend resources now to get digital arts education out? Do we save it for whenever in-person education can happen again? As well as helping, trying to pay the artists who were expecting this work. Artists in particular have been hit hard by all the closures because their primary source was selling art to people face to face, and then a lot of their secondary resources were serving or in the service sector, which has also been hit hard. So trying to honor that with the artists. And with community schools, a big part of that is trying to help the school become a hub of resources for the local neighborhood community. And so trying to deal with what does that look like when everything shuts down and there's different policies and procedures at play as to who can come on campus and what services can be provided on campus. So trying to balance that while also making sure that the families that our schools serve can still have access to those resources they've come to expect at community schools is a big challenge. There was a family who just right before the pandemic hit, they lost their home, and they were living in a hotel room, and then the pandemic hit and everything closed down, and then the family got a couple members of the family got sick with coronavirus, and then they were living in a hotel room, so it spread to everyone. And so trying to help families like that when schools are closed and resources are closed, and that family didn't have access to internet, so trying to get in touch with them and connect them to resources was a struggle. And the same thing's been happening all over the city at each one of our schools, trying to make sure that everyone is stabilized as best as they can be. Has been a struggle.
Thanks for that, Jeff. I really appreciate it. I'm going to kick it over to Mariah to ask our next question.
Thank you. So I know that your organizations, even if you're just with Jimmy Carter, probably have external partnerships and work with other organizations or schools. So we're interested in how that's changed over the last couple of months. Maybe you've engaged some newer partners, maybe you've engaged organizations that are providing additional resources or whatever. So we're wondering, how have these collaborations with existing or new partners changed in the last 2 months? And how maybe are you looking for additional organizations to work with to address some of these challenges that you're talking about? Duta, let's start with you.
Yeah, good question. So the ones that jump out to me are really the New Mexico Dream Team. We've launched a relief fund called Stronger Together, just because we had conversations amongst each other when this first hit. That was like, there was a few of the foundations that support us now that, pretty quickly turned around and says, hey, here's a chunk of money, can you use it? And so we both we're feeling that, and we have a couple of projects together, youth organizing and borderland narrative shift. We started to talk and said that, well, when we pitch together, when we propose these ideas together, we're hitting a larger community, and we're actually hitting some of the same disparities that exist in our communities. And so the New Mexico Dream Team, for folks who are familiar, does work with primarily undocumented and immigrant youth and families. And so our relationship with them has been really, really strengthened. There are a couple other organizations. Actually, Robert is one of our Kellogg fellows. But Tina over at the Street Food Institute has responded and said, hey, what food resources that your families need, and how can we work together to get them some hot meals? She's also helped us make some connections on some of the supplies. So actually our parent and community organizer, every Friday, I think every other Friday now, gives out food boxes to, I think it's increasing. I think she's in between 30 and 50 families every Friday, and tries to make sure that they have 2 weeks worth of supplies and food. So Tina has really been helpful on that, as well as some folks over at some of the local paper goods distributors, and then I think the community partners have really kind of shifted. If I think about our partnership with La Placita, in which we were supposed to get a community garden up and going, that's paused, and that we're still kind of hanging in the balance. And luckily, most funders and grant providers have been really, really flexible in this time. But yeah, those are the highlights that I think about.
Good coach. That's really interesting, and it's wonderful to hear about the food set for 2 weeks. I can't imagine the relief that provides. And you said that was from the Shreveport Institute?
Yeah, the Street Food Institute, partnering with our parent and community organization.
Right on. Okay, Miranda, go ahead and add what you've got for some of the partnerships you're working with, or maybe some that you'd like to start.
Sure. So we've actually been trying to do kind of a two-way, I guess. A lot of our resources that we may have for classes that we can't have in person right now, things like respiratory therapy and other stuff, we're actually loaning that equipment out and stuff for those different areas that need that equipment, which has been pretty exciting. And our Fuse Maker space has been making all kinds of PPE for folks and kind of getting that out there. I know there's another question later talking about funding, so I don't want to kind of jump into that too much, but those are kind of our main areas. We're kind of working with APS and with other schools to figure out how to keep our dual credit going. A lot of high schoolers are really appreciating having something to keep going with and something to do. And then, of course, I'm just, thinking of all the other kind of groups that we've teamed up with, the city and others, to offer different services like Wi-Fi in the parking lots and stuff like that. And so just a few to throw out there for right now.
That's a lot. It's really good to have a well-rounded set of support. Simona, how about you? What you got for us?
So I am listening to what everyone's saying and writing down these resources because we have a lot of challenges at Jimmy Carter, and I'm not like directing this to the principal at all because she is new and she has made some great improvements. But I'll be honest with you, I'm only in my third year of teaching, but I didn't even realize these resources were out here or that this was even a thing. So we have a ton of like first years at Jimmy Carter. We're a very challenged school. And I don't think a lot of us are even aware that these resources are out there for us to provide the families with. That New Mexico Dream Team, I just copied everything down that Duta was saying because we have tons of undocumented immigrant families at our school. And man, these are some great resources. So I think it's going to be my mission to tap in, find out what these resources are, and then like tap into them. Yeah.
Yeah, definitely some creative ideas are coming out of this that we've seen over the last weeks. And we're going to definitely encourage each other to share your contact info and your emails and whatnot. I'll speak for the panelists just because I know everybody's really willing to share what they know and share resources. And so just as a side note, before I let Jeff wrap us up with this question, anybody who's in our audience today, if you have resources to share, please do type them into the chat. If you have ideas for the schools or organizations, that's where you're at. We'd love to hear from you. Jeff, how about you and your partnerships? I know that you're working in a couple different capacities, so feel free to expand.
Yeah, I think one of the things about community schools in particular is that they are schools that intentionally engage nonprofit partners, a wide range of partners, but nonprofits in particular. And so there's one of the things that a lot of our schools are doing is they are hosting meetings with their partners and asking them, what's going on with you right now? What do you need? How can we make sure that you make it through this crisis so that you can still be here for our students, which is a really powerful thing. And in fact, ABC Community Schools is going to be hosting a partnership kind of town hall later in the summer to gather data and information from nonprofit partners who work with community schools to see how we can help facilitate some partnerships, hopefully leverage some resources so that folks can continue working at full capacity. One of the really interesting partnerships that we're working on is we're trying to work with a trauma-informed collaborative, essentially. where there's a significant amount of trauma that even before this, that students in Albuquerque face and experience, and as well as teachers. Not only do teachers experience trauma themselves, but they by nature of their job, internalize the trauma of their students. And so we're working with a professor from NMSU, from folks at All Faiths, and some other folks who are working on creating some trainings and resources for teachers to, one, help them understand when their students are responding to trauma, and not just viewing that as, well, they have poor behavior, but understanding that it's a response to trauma. What trauma is, not only big T trauma, which is what they call it when they do the trainings, which is what you think about with like abuse or neglect, but also systemic trauma that communities have faced for generations, and what that means, and how teachers can respond to that in a positive way. How teachers can also take care of themselves and understand when they're responding to trauma. And kind of, be able to take a step back, do some self-care, but also hopefully respond in a positive way to students, as well as looking at schools, systems level, like behavior policies and discipline policies, and understanding when those aren't conducive to helping students who are experiencing trauma, when they're just, punishment based as opposed to restorative based. So that's one of the partnerships that we're really, we've kind of did a little bit of it earlier, but now with this whole pandemic, there's folks out there who are essentially saying you should act like that every student in the entire country has experienced some trauma through this. And so really trying to figure out what that looks like when school comes back, or, currently, how we can help teachers get tools to have trauma-informed and trauma-responsive educational practices, whether they're going to be doing distance learning or in classroom learning. So there's a lot of partnerships, but I think that's one of the ones that to me seems most urgent, at least for moving forward, when helping understand how trauma impacts education and how trauma deepens inequities in education, and how we can view that as a root cause to a lot of the other issues that we're experiencing in education.
That's really impressive. It sounds like all of us would be able to benefit from those, that collective learning. And also, if at any point you have more information about the town hall, you can share it on the Impactors page for more people to join in. So thank you very much for that. Robert, go ahead. We've got a time, I think, for a couple more.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, Mariah. And thanks everyone for answering that last question. It was really cool stuff. I was writing out a bunch of notes. Duta, you actually hinted on this in the last question, but two things. So we've seen some of our funding, our local funders step up and provide emergency funding to nonprofits and across the sector. So the first question is, one, have you applied for any of that relief funding, or have you applied even for the SBA or government funding? And the second question is, how can funders be more responsive to community needs? The reason I'm asking that question is, to this day, philanthropy is still primarily giving to white-led nonprofits and not necessarily giving to nonprofits led by communities of color still. There was a study that was done by Bridgespan and published last week in the Stanford Social Innovation Review. So we want to make sure that we comment on how funders can be more responsive, especially for our children and our families here in New Mexico. And we'll start with Miranda.
Great. So we definitely applied for the federal funding, and we're actually in process right now. They gave us kind of two buckets, and so one for kind of college needs, and we're working on some technology and other things that we would need to help kind of get students and faculty and staff up to. Mostly students to get to being able to learn and do things online in a way that's maybe a little bit more supported. But we're also giving out funding to students through the CARES Act. We have about $4 million to give out, and so far I think we've given out over $1 million. And this is from folks letting us know kind of what's happened in their personal lives and how we can support them. And so The only weird thing is the funding is tied to folks' financial aid status, which really does kick a lot of folks out, makes them not qualify for it. So about a little less than half of our students qualify for financial aid, but it really does leave a lot of populations out. And so we're trying to figure out some other ways to help those groups. We have some other scholarships and funding available, but those have been kind of our big things. And some of the biggest things that our students are telling us that have happened to them, of course, the transition to online classes was rough for a lot of people. And I don't know about you, online learning is really tough for me. I've done it in a way that like synchronous, where I can look at you and, you know, we're in a class kind of like this, and that works well for me. But it's just tough. It's a lot harder to do online learning and teaching online as well. And so that's been something that we're facing. But a lot of our students have lost their jobs, or their primary person in their home has lost their jobs. They need, you know, computer or other kind of technology and tools, caring for family, just all kinds of different things. And so most of the folks who've applied for our funding have had at least two of these kind of life issues happen for them. We also have a emergency scholarship that is not tied to financial aid that we've been giving out a lot of as well. But it's been crazy to see and read the stories and to kind of hear from our students the things that they're facing, and yet they're still persevering and still finishing classes. We just did a virtual graduation. We had 600 students participate in a virtual graduation, like so awesome. But anyway, sorry, I got excited about it, but we're super excited to be able to give these folks get some of these funds out. And so we'll have some finishing up for the folks who are here in spring. And then we've also got funding for summer students as well, who are in need. So we have a ton of scholarships. So please help us share that. We've got a ton ready for people. So yeah.
That's helpful. Thanks, Miranda. And also thanks for sharing, celebrating like this rite of passage around graduation virtually too. I know a lot of folks aren't getting to do that, and it's important for our families to actually experience that. I know some folks are doing one this Friday here in South Broadway, so that's really great. Jeff, we're going to jump over to you and just see what you think.
Yeah, so neither of the organizations that I'm representing today have applied for any relief funding. I guess kind of maybe like in roundabout ways, because we are technically, ABC Community Schools is technically like a conglomerate of APS, the city, and the county. And so there's been some relief funding coming in that way, but not necessarily directly through community schools. But my experience working in the nonprofit sector, there's definitely been some funders who have done a great job of making relief funding easily accessible and available, but not enough, I would say. I think one of the biggest things that funders really need to be aware of is right now, stabilization is key. And when people are experiencing, vast health inequities, there's not much else that can, that's a big barrier to anything else happening right now. And funders have access to the data. They know which communities are being impacted more. They know, as Duta said, like a lot of folks on the Navajo Nation and Pueblos in New Mexico in particular are getting hit hard. So funders need to divert their resources, vast amounts of resources, to those communities ASAP with as few hoops as possible to jump through, and as little process. Yes, you want to make sure you know where the money goes, but as little accountability and reporting requirements as possible. Just make sure that the money gets to communities that need it, and they can use it in as flexible a way as possible. And I think that's one thing that funders really need to take a step back on and realize that the communities know best where the money should go and where it should be used. And so they should let those communities use the money in the way that they feel is best for themselves, without putting too many strings or their own bias or their own filter on it. And so I would, if there's any funders out there listening, I would highly advocate for that. Give money quickly, make it easy to get, and make it easy to report. just from what I've seen, there's so many barriers that some people just kind of throw up their hands and say, well, forget it, I'm not going to apply for the funding, and then it doesn't get to the communities that need it the most.
Absolutely. Thanks, Jeff, for that. I appreciate it. Simona, we'll jump up to you.
Can I get just a repeat of the question real quick?
So I'm on mute, so I'll just, of course, we'll repeat the question. So we've seen some funders step up and provide emergency funding to nonprofits. Has your organization applied for any emergency relief funding from a foundation or any of the SBA or federal funding that's been happening with the CARES Act? And the second question is, how can funders be more responsive to community needs, especially for your students and for your families?
Okay. Well, applying for the funding, I'm not sure of. I'm not sure if anybody at my school knows about this, so some communication on funding would be great. One thing that funders could do to help our kids is to not like withhold funds because they're maybe not legal citizens, things like that. We have a lot of kids that come fresh from Mexico, so to put a stipulation on their status, that would really suck for our kids. So I would say to not, like Jeff was saying, give the money, give it fast, and let the communities decide what to do with it. Yeah.
Thanks, Simona. Co-sign that. Duta, we'll jump to you next.
Yeah, well, as Aaron knows, our school and the network, we go after a lot of grants, and so we get funded almost like almost like a nonprofit in terms of how many other funds that we have, in addition to what schools get, right? And so, and a lot of it is related to the programming that we're doing around wellness, identity, land-based learning, etc. That's typically not funded through the state equalization guarantee. And so, as a result, some of the grants that we've gotten, as you might know, the scope of work is hard to achieve given the stay-at-home orders. And so many of the funders immediately responded to us and saying that you can make a request to move this to general operating funds, which is super helpful in being able to give some sort of response to our families and community. And then a few of our funders have actually made available other grants. So like the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation and the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, both of whom we were grantees, then made available another pot of funds. And so that has enabled us to give out distributions to our families and community. So we've given one wave and are in the midst of it of stipends to our families. And so we're doing two things. So direct financial assistance to families in the form of $500 stipends, and also the distribution of supplies and food that I talked about earlier. And a lot of it has been really made possible by the relationships we've had. So another big chunk of money came in from our partners over at WEND, and that really is what made the Stronger Together Fund possible, because us and the New Mexico Dream Team are actually grantees, and so they were like, what is your community need, and I think like Jeff mentioned, like we were being really cognizant of, like, we have 3 schools in our network on the Navajo Nation. We have 1 school in Santa Clara Pueblo, and we know there's a lot of other funds. There's the Navajo Hopi Relief Fund. There's the Zuni Food Assistance Fund. There's the Native American Relief Fund that's being handled out of the New Mexico Foundation. The Americans for Indian Opportunity just launched an urban Indian relief fund. So there's tons of initiatives, right? And so we didn't want to step on the toes of the funding initiatives that were directly serving families in the communities that have been most affected. And so much of our fundraising efforts have been based upon our current funding relationships, which is a little bit different. I would plug with our partners with the New Mexico Dream Team. They have a GoFundMe, and if you go to their Facebook page or their website, the New Mexico Dream Team, you'll find their charge of raising $50,000 to help directly affected families. Since most of the federal funds are not, a lot of the families who are undocumented are not eligible, and so I think there's similar stories from across that tell the story of the cross movement from indigenous and native families to undocumented immigrant families. And I think we've largely not tapped some of our funding partners here in the state, and most of them have been national to this point. But doing what we can for sure. And I know that we didn't initially, when all of this happened, didn't think that as a school or a network we'd be doing any sort of response or relief funding, and have actually had to learn quite a bit in terms of our own capacity and capability of distributing funds, like the back end of what it means to get those types of payments and supplies and food out is a lot. On the front end, it looks pretty and it looks like, oh, that's cool that they're doing that. So I think that's been a major learning for us. And I think anyone who receives funds, like the capacity to be able to distribute it is a huge question. So luckily we've been able to build that as we were flying it, but it could because our families need it.
Thanks, Duta. And also just thanks for talking a little about like what it's like to distribute money. I know that's very challenging too, but it's also something that I know personally I would recommend for folks, especially for funders, just give people the money. Ryan, I'm going to kick it over to you to ask our fourth question.
Sure. So thinking back in relevance to some of the challenges you mentioned and some of the topics that we've covered already about, equity of access for technology, equity of access to funds. There's a lot of things that we've seen that we, as Robert was saying, we don't want to see go back to normal. And so this question is about how this pandemic has really exposed so much inequities in our communities. And we want to talk a little bit more in depth about what you think you would like to see moving forward, about how things or characteristics or policies or leadership or funding or whatever it comes to mind that you'd like to see improve and change for the future as we continue to deal with this pandemic and as maybe when we're done with this pandemic. And so as a piece of that, if there are any topics around what you would most strongly advocate for our policymakers to be thinking about in our state, we'd like to hear about that. Let's see, why don't we go back to Jeff? Talk to us a little bit about what you'd like to see coming out of this.
Yeah, I think one of the things that has seems to become clear to me is that the resilience in our world lies in hyperlocal community, and the from the schools that we work with, what we've seen is people are getting fed because neighborhood volunteers are running food banks, and people are getting access to resources that they need because their local community is stepping up and doing it. While there's resources at the city, county, and state and federal level, I think that the resiliency really is drawn from local community. And I think there's a lot of lessons to be learned from letting local communities drive the decision making. I kind of touched on that before in my previous answer with what funders can do, but I really think that policymakers in particular at the state level and the federal level really need to support initiatives that are community driven and locally driven, as opposed to doing the top down approach that they've done for so very long, because that's how communities build their own resilience. And I think that that's an important lesson to learn, and I hope one that we can carry through when this pandemic is done. And I would advocate to see more dollars and resources not be necessarily dictated from the top, but provided to even on the neighborhood level, organizations and people to do what they do best, which is help one another out, and really take a look at how resources are distributed. Currently very inequitable, and making a conscious effort to change that, and not just hoping that it becomes more equitable, but making policies and procedures, whether it's a funder, like a private funder or state funder, making conscious choices to ensure that their funding gets distributed equitably. I think would be some positive lessons to learn from this.
I would agree. Everything. Absolutely. Thank you, Jeff. Simona, how about you? What are you thinking about with the inequities that you're seeing and how you'd like to see some changes after this?
So I would love to see some form of informing our teachers and a lot of our newbies about this funding just beyond an email. If there could be some kind of professional development or just education for our new teachers that this is out there or available for them, I think that would be extremely helpful. And as far as policy making, oh my gosh, where do you start there? I just wish, I don't know, more equitable funding for the schools. I know we're super underfunded at Jimmy, and now, I see it showing with my lack of knowledge about this. So just some more education on funding, especially for our newbies.
I think that that's a really good point, is who are the people that are connecting to our students on a daily basis, and how much access to information and resources do they have at the beginning of the day, at the beginning of the semester. And I know like at CNM and at UNM, they've got developmental programs for faculty, but it wouldn't hurt to add in a piece about this. I think given my experience at the university, I can't speak to the public school system in Albuquerque, but I hear what you're saying, and I support that. It's probably
because I heard about one grant and I applied for it because I've been really, really wanting to take my kids to Acoma Pueblo for the tour, and I was talking with Acoma and I got the numbers and the math, and I knew that there was no way we could do it unless we did have some kind of funding or some kind of grant. But the one I applied for, I believe it was Golden Apple that I knew about, I got turned down for. So just knowing about more funding would be awesome.
great. Thank you. Miranda, let's go ahead and follow up that.
Sure. I think this whole situation has really shown just how, like you said, how much this, the decisions and the way that this has all gone down has affected our folks who are most at risk, honestly. And we've seen it in the way that, we have a lot of on-campus interaction with students, and some of the ones that are the most at risk are the ones that have kind of vanished since all of this has happened, and we can't get a hold of them. We have this funding available that we want to give to students, and it feels like we're not able to give as much away as quickly as we would like because we don't have a way to get a hold of some of these folks. And so that's been something that we've been struggling with. I mentioned some information that we got from our students. Well, we sent that out through text and email to get responses from them, and for some folks that's not an option for them if they can't get to campus and use our computer labs, or if they don't have access to a phone that has data, or all of those kind of situations. And so for us, it's really trying to, I know our decision makers, our executive team is really trying to be as equitable as possible in how we kind of open things back up for our school. There's just so many, we've got 23,000 people that we got to figure out how they're going to come back and do it safely, and what all that looks like, and make sure that we're not kind of, putting folks out that can't kind of deal with everything. And so that's just been a lot of what's kind of been on our mind as we've been communicating and doing some different things with our groups. I know it's not necessarily policy kind of conversation, but it just seems like this has affected, as we all know, it's affected folks in very different ways. And for some of us who are lucky to be able to work from home and get to keep our jobs and keep going, it's been, good. But for a lot of our folks that we're serving, a lot of our students, that's just not the case. And so just trying to get people connected to what we have available for them, but also making those decisions in a really ethical and equitable way to make sure that we come back and kind of move forward in a really good way, good positive manner.
Great. Thank you very much, Miranda. Okay, Duta? Go ahead.
I think there's a couple of things that come to my mind, right? Like the state special session is coming up soon, in which we're likely to see, I think there's impending budget cuts. We know that the oil and gas industry in our state, of which is the primary investment, has lost money, and as such, our state will. And so I think there's some major questions of like, what impact is this going to have on education? What impact will this have on healthcare? And what is the balance going to be between the two industries in terms of setting those priorities? And so, as a team, we've talked about like, what is our stance when it comes to, the Yazzie Martinez ruling, and making sure that there's adequate funding available to respond to the provisions set out in that case. At the same time, making sure that it's not an either or for healthcare. And so legislators have a huge task ahead of them as they think about where to make cuts and what to make cuts on. I think there's a level that we would advocate for in terms of like what would close to a flat budget look like, and then how can we scenario plan for other sort of circumstances, from like 2 to 5% to 10% cuts on our budgets. And how do we make sure that our schools are still sustainable? The other thing that I think about is, this gets into the kind of the federal trust relationship that exists with tribes. But if you just look at some of the raw data available, say like with the Navajo Nation, when you compare the Navajo Nation's size, it compares similar to West Virginia, right? And you think about the infrastructure that exists in West Virginia versus the Navajo Nation, there's some inequities for sure. And so you think about like access to hospitals. I don't know off the top of my head how many hospitals, but I think there are probably 10 times as many hospitals in the state of West Virginia as there are in the Navajo Nation. Similar, like access to quality food, so grocery stores, what type of food systems exist on indigenous land bases. So I think there's some infrastructure and kind of like systemic type of questions to answer in terms of what is the dynamic of state support versus federal support for tribes, and then what does that look like when you're thinking about cities, understanding that most indigenous populations live in urban areas. And so I think like policy-wise, it's a huge task, right? And it makes me take a big sigh, a big breath, and like there's a lot to be figured out. And I don't think it's gonna get harder before it gets easier. And even trying to project and trying to plan into the unknown of like how long are we gonna exist in this COVID stay-at-home closure type of setting. So Those are the things that are on my mind. And apologies, they're not solutions per se.
I understand it's a heavy question, heavy answers. Thank you for that. I'll send it over to Robert to wrap us up with our last question very quickly. And for those of you that are still around, please enter your resources in the chat. And also, Robert will make note of what Sephora was just mentioning in the chat also.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that very important part of our panel. I think, we have a very large hill to climb, especially with a special session. I hear that it's going to be on June 19th, so keep note of when that date will be. Mark your calendars. And also, too, write your legislators, let them know what you're seeing from your nonprofit, too. Sephora, if you could share your survey from New Mexico Thrives, that'd be really great in the chat as well, to use as a coalition of nonprofits and organizations to advocate more effectively with our legislators. They need to know and hear from us. We're the third largest sector in our state. And according to studies, we've provided more jobs since the recession than any of the other sectors combined. So, well, not combined, sorry, that's an overstatement. But we definitely outpace in terms of also wages too. We actually outpace state jobs for wages in the nonprofit sector comparatively, and outpace manufacturing as well. So this last question is our what we ask everybody when we end in Magna Coffee, and that's, what can our community do for you today? There's a lot of folks working from home that are looking for volunteer opportunities, and also just looking for ways to engage organizations and help out. And so we'll go ahead and get started with you, Simona, if you could.
I'm sorry, Simona, start again. We're going to go ahead and unmute. There you go.
Okay. So I feel like a lot has already been done for me this morning. Just opening my eyes to this. Jamie, thank you for inviting me. So for me, for my community, at Jimmy, I would say the most you could do is probably educate our educators on these opportunities, these resources.
Thank you. We're just going to right down the line. So Miranda.
Sure. Number one thing I would love your help with is please tell people that we're open. You'd be surprised at how many people are like, oh yeah, everyone's closed. You're not doing anything, right? That is not true. We're offering so many services, so many things, so many classes online. Our summer term is fully ready to go. It starts on Monday, so there's still time, everybody. We'd love to see you as a CNM student. And then the other piece is, I mentioned the federal funding that we're giving away, but we also have an emergency scholarship through our foundation. It's called the REST Emergency Scholarship, and that is it's not tied to any federal or FAFSA kind of requirements. It's for students who've had unforeseen life issues that could derail them from finishing their classes. And so it is offered all the time, but now more than ever, it is super, super important. And so if folks are interested in that kind of opportunity, we've given over $25,000 out in scholarships just since COVID has started for this particular scholarship. And so folks can either donate to that scholarship at cnm.edu/foundation, or just sharing that it's out there. Again, it's one of those that people students don't know that it's there. And so, anybody who's a CNM student in need, please share that with them, and send anybody our way who's interested in some classes. So thank you so much for the time today.
Thanks, Miranda. Jeff, what can we do for y'all today?
Yeah, I think a couple things. One, if you are with a nonprofit or work with a nonprofit and are interested in having working very community specific and responding to community driven and community identified needs and concerns, I know there's going to be a lot of need for additional support and resources for students and families in the coming months and years, then get involved with a community school. I know sometimes APS can present a barrier to participation with schools sometimes for nonprofits, but at the community schools, essentially present a really strong pathway to get involved with your community and your school. So if you're interested in getting involved as a nonprofit with community schools and you don't know if your local school or which schools are community schools, you can contact me. My email is jandersen, JANDERSEN @burnco.gov. And alternatively, if you're an individual who's not necessarily connected to a nonprofit and you want to get involved in community schools, especially if you live near one, because one of the things about community schools is they look at perspectives of all stakeholders who have a vested interest in that community thriving and succeeding, and they want to invite them to make decisions and be equal partners in their schools. So if you're an individual, and especially if you live in near a community school and want to get involved, there's positions called community school coordinators at each of the schools. So contact them. If you don't know all that information, again, you can feel free to email me and get in touch with me. I'd be happy to direct you. There's 34 community schools in ABC's network across Albuquerque. And I know there are others that aren't necessarily officially part of our network. So check it out if you want to get involved and help make decisions and help provide resources that are driven by the community.
Thanks, Jeff. And to close this out, Duta.
Yeah, I think what folks could do is to support the organizations. There's I'm putting into the chat the websites for NISN, NACA, and also the Dream Team. There's a place to donate to NACA. However, like the most useful things for us would be supplies and food, just because we have a chunk of funding from some of our current existing funders to be able to support our families. I think there's also the option in terms of the network to support some of our sister schools. So we have a sister school in Gallup, in Navajo, in Shiprock, as well as Santa Clara, and then a sister school in Las Cruces. So we've been able to offer some support of them, and then plug in Eduardo, Felipe, and Ellie organization with the New Mexico Dream Team. They got a GoFundMe campaign that's currently raising funds for undocumented and immigrant youth and families. So I would send folks that way, and reach out to me if you have any questions, for sure.
Thanks, Duta. And big thanks to all of our panelists today for sharing your stories and the stories of your communities. It means so much. So big pat on your backs and big round of applause, virtual round of applause for everybody. Thank you so much for spending some time. That does it for Impact and Coffee this week. We'll be back next Tuesday, May 19th. That will be our last Impact and Coffee for May. The one after that will be June 2nd. And so, Mariah, is there anything else you want to add before we close it down for the day?
My gratitude to all of you on our panel today, and those of you that spent the hour with us as audience members and offering your resources. These hours once a week are really meaningful so much to all of us, and sharing this time together and our resources it goes a long way. And I also want to send a shout out to our educators. Really, really, really thank you. And through you to your students who are graduating and finishing a semester that was just crazy. Kudos to all of you in the work that you do. So thank you.
Thanks, Mariah. And thank everyone for joining us this morning for our very special series this morning. Again, we'll be back on May 19th here at 9 a.m. virtually. Share it on your Facebook, tag your pictures, all that good stuff. The video of this will be available pretty soon, probably in the next 24 hours or so y'all can share it on your social medias. So thanks, everyone. Have a really great Tuesday, and may all your lights be green.
Thank you.
We'll see you soon.